What would you do if your child was taken in the dead of night and the world seemed to turn its back on your search? This is the chilling and mysterious case of Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old girl abducted from her own home, held captive for 9 months, and lost in a web of lies spun by the people she trusted most. But in the end, the truth would come out, shocking, twisted, and heartbreaking. Salt Lake City, Utah. June 5th, 2002. A night that started like any other for 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart, but that would change forever. In the dead of night, a man named Brian David Mitchell snuck into her room, took her at knife point, and disappeared into the mountains with her. What followed would be a 9 months nightmare, a tale of deception, manipulation, and lies that kept Elizabeth captive in plain sight. But no one knew who could be behind it or why. In this episode, we'll unravel the terrifying details of Elizabeth's abduction, the tireless investigation that gripped the nation, and the shocking twists that led to her rescue. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is the story of the man and woman who held her captive and how they manipulated the entire world into believing a lie. What happened to Elizabeth Smart, and how did her captors escape detection for so long? Elizabeth Smart was not just another teenager. She was a 14-year-old girl full of life, intelligence, and promise. Born on November 3, 1987, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Elizabeth grew up in a close-knit, loving family. Her father, Ed Smart, was a well-established businessman known in the community for his successful work in real estate. Her mother, Lois Smart, was a devoted stay-at-home mom, raising Elizabeth and her 5 siblings with a strong sense of love and care. The Smart family's home was always filled with warmth, laughter, and the sounds of family activities. Elizabeth, who was active in school and loved music, was described as a bright and friendly young girl, someone who had a bright future ahead of her. Elizabeth's family was well respected in their community. Her father, Ed, had a significant role in their local church and was known for his charitable work. Lois, too, was a caring figure, often organizing community events and being the anchor of their home. They were an ordinary family living in an ordinary neighborhood until June 5, 2002, when that all changed. That night, Elizabeth was fast asleep in her room, unaware of the horror that would soon unfold. It was like any other summer night, calm, peaceful, with a soft breeze moving through the windows of the Smart home. But the quiet would soon be shattered by the unimaginable, a stranger creeping into their home, abducting Elizabeth, and vanishing into the night. The Smart family awoke the next morning to find their daughter gone. Her bed was empty and her room was untouched, except for a broken window and a disturbed sense of normality. The realization struck with a terrifying force. Their daughter was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no ransom note, no clue as to where she could have gone. Panic set in immediately, and soon the entire neighborhood was in chaos. The hours, then days, that followed were filled with desperation. The Smart family reached out to the media, to local authorities, and to anyone who could help find their daughter. What followed was a nationwide search, broadcast on television, with police officers, volunteers, and the FBI working tirelessly to uncover any lead. It was a heartbreaking time, filled with uncertainty. How could Elizabeth simply disappear without a trace? Who would do such a thing? And most importantly, why her? The individuals responsible for Elizabeth's abduction were Brian David Mitchell and his wife Wanda Barzee. Brian Mitchell, a 49-year-old man with a long history of criminal activity, was a drifter, a person who never stayed in one place for long. He had lived a troubled life, marked by mental instability and a tendency to believe in strange, often dangerous ideas. Mitchell was raised in a religious household, but as he grew older, he twisted his beliefs, eventually developing a messianic complex. He believed he was a prophet, chosen by God to carry out a mission that would change the course of history. Mitchell's relationship with his wife, Wanda Barzee, was equally disturbing. Barzee, who was in her 50s at the time of Elizabeth's abduction, was deeply influenced by Mitchell's delusions. Together, the two formed a bond based on their shared belief that they had a divine purpose. It wasn't until much later in the investigation that authorities would uncover the depth of their delusions and how these beliefs would lead them to commit unspeakable crimes. Mitchell and Barzee had lived in various places, moving frequently and often staying in abandoned homes or makeshift shelters. They didn't have stable jobs or a permanent residence. Mitchell was a man who lived on the fringes of society, disconnected from any real sense of responsibility or accountability. His obsession with religious delusions only deepened his instability, and his behavior became more erratic over time. On the night of Elizabeth's abduction, Mitchell had been preparing for what he believed was a divine mission. He had been living in the Salt Lake City area for some time, and it was during this time that he set his sights on Elizabeth. His reasoning was twisted, his actions cold and calculated. He believed that he was rescuing Elizabeth, or perhaps even saving her, in a way that made no sense to anyone else. For him, it was all part of a grander plan, a mission from God. But for Elizabeth, it was the beginning of a horrific ordeal. Wanda Barzee, though complicit in the abduction, played a slightly different role. She had been married to Mitchell for years, and by the time of Elizabeth's kidnapping, she was firmly under his influence. Barzee had a history of mental health struggles and was, by all accounts, a woman who had lost touch with reality. Together, Mitchell and Barzee formed a toxic partnership, a pair of criminals who believed their actions were justified by divine intervention. What was even more chilling was that Mitchell and Barzee's actions would remain hidden for months. While the police and the public were desperately searching for Elizabeth, the couple was living just a short distance away, hiding in plain sight. Their lies, manipulations, and twisted beliefs kept Elizabeth trapped in a world that no one knew existed. The night of Elizabeth Smart's abduction began like any other. She had gone to bed around 10 p.m., as usual, after a long day of activities. It was a Tuesday, and the family had no reason to suspect anything unusual. But as the night wore on, an intruder silently crept into the Smart family home. Brian Mitchell, armed with a knife, broke into Elizabeth's room at around 1 a.m. The window was open and he slipped in quietly. Elizabeth was asleep, unaware of the danger. Mitchell then approached her bed, waking her and threatening her with the knife. He told her to get up, and in that moment her life changed forever. At that moment, Elizabeth did not scream or fight. She complied, terrified of what Mitchell would do if she didn't. With no one else in the house aware of the danger, Mitchell led Elizabeth out of her room and out of the house. As the Smart family slept, Elizabeth was taken, just like that, in the middle of the night. When Ed and Lois Smart woke up to find their daughter gone, they were understandably frantic. Elizabeth's room was empty, her bed neatly made, but she was gone. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. The only sign that something was wrong was the broken window. The family immediately contacted the police, and within hours, Salt Lake City became the epicenter of a frantic search for the missing teenager. What followed was an exhaustive effort to find Elizabeth. Law enforcement agencies from all over the country, along with the FBI, launched a full-scale investigation. But the trail quickly grew cold. For days, no one knew where she was. The public rallied behind the Smart family, showing their support. But behind the scenes, Elizabeth's captors were already far ahead, plotting their next move. June 5, 2002, began as an ordinary day for the Smart family. It was a quiet evening in Salt Lake City, with the air cooling as the sun set. Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old girl who had just finished a busy day of school and extracurricular activities, went to bed that night like any other. She was tucked under her covers, drifting into a peaceful sleep in her bedroom on the second floor of her family's home. At approximately 1 a.m., however, everything changed. Unknown to Elizabeth, a man was silently approaching her home. Brian David Mitchell, a man with a history of mental illness and criminal behavior, had been planning this night for some time. Armed with a knife, he made his way to the Smart family home, and once there, he climbed through a window into Elizabeth's room. Elizabeth was fast asleep, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Mitchell woke her by threatening her with a knife, forcing her out of bed. He told her to come with him, or he would harm her. Completely terrified and confused, Elizabeth did not scream, knowing her best chance of survival was to comply. Mitchell, who had been living in the Salt Lake City area for some time, was driven by deep delusions that he had a divine mission to carry out. He believed that he was meant to take Elizabeth, and he was convinced that this action was part of a greater plan. With a terrified Elizabeth following him, Mitchell led her out of the house, through the yard, and into the night. What followed was a dark journey into the wilderness. Mitchell led Elizabeth, still in her pajamas, into the mountains surrounding Salt Lake City. It was in this remote area, far from the familiar world she had known, where Elizabeth would spend the next 9 months trapped in a nightmare. Mitchell's wife, Wanda Barzee, would later join them in their hideout, and together they would impose their twisted beliefs on Elizabeth. The Smart family, meanwhile, awoke the next morning to discover that their daughter was missing. Elizabeth's bedroom was eerily quiet. There were no signs of a struggle, just a broken window. It was a chilling discovery. The police were called immediately, and the search began. At first, authorities believed that Elizabeth may have run away or had been taken by someone close to the family. But as the days passed and no contact was made, the truth began to emerge. Someone had taken Elizabeth against her will. The investigation quickly expanded, and the whole country soon became involved in the search. Investigators arrived at the Smart home to gather evidence. The first thing they noticed was the broken window, clearly showing that someone had forced their way inside. There were no signs of a struggle, but Elizabeth's absence was unsettling. Her parents immediately became the center of attention, as is often the case in child abduction cases. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that this was no random kidnapping. Search teams combed the area around Salt Lake City, using helicopters and search dogs to trace any signs of Elizabeth's whereabouts. The police also worked tirelessly to question neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have information. But nothing turned up in the first few days. There were no ransom notes, no calls demanding money, or making any further demands. The search stretched from Salt Lake City to surrounding towns, but there were no leads. As the days turned into weeks, the public's concern grew. The media covered every angle of the search, with Elizabeth's face splashed across news stations and missing person reports. The Smart family, devastated by the loss of their daughter, made repeated public pleas for her safe return. Ed and Lois Smart, unable to sit idly by, worked alongside authorities entirely supported for answers. For months, the investigation went on, but there were no leads. The police followed up on tips, but each one turned out to be a dead end. It seemed as though the trail had gone cold. All the while, Mitchell and Barzee were lying low, living just a few miles away from where Elizabeth's family was desperately searching. Hiding in plain sight, they would move around frequently, staying in abandoned houses or shelters to avoid detection. The couple continued their delusional lifestyle, fully believing that what they were doing was justified by God. They kept Elizabeth with them, moving from one remote location to another in an attempt to keep her isolated from the outside world. They manipulated her, using fear and their strange beliefs to control her every move. Elizabeth, forced to comply with her captors, could not escape. There was nowhere to run. Mitchell and Barzee's attempts to keep Elizabeth hidden were aided by their strange belief system. Brian Mitchell, with his messianic delusions, believed he was on a divine mission, and Elizabeth was just another piece in his bizarre plan. Meanwhile, Wanda Barzee, who was deeply influenced by Mitchell's ideas, played along with the story, helping him keep Elizabeth captive. As time went on, investigators continued to pursue leads, following any information they could find. But all the while, Elizabeth was just a few miles away, hidden from the world. The public was left wondering, how could they have missed her? How could this girl who had been kidnapped in the middle of the night be so close to being found but still remain out of reach? It wasn't until March 12, 2003, almost 9 months later, that the case would take a dramatic turn. Elizabeth, now barely recognizable due to her captivity, was spotted in a public place. A woman who had been following the case recognized Mitchell and Barzee from the news. She immediately alerted the authorities, who swiftly responded. When police arrived at the scene, they arrested Mitchell and Barzee, and Elizabeth was finally rescued. The months of searching and endless public pleas had come to an end. But the story was far from over. The discovery of Elizabeth, alive and well, shocked the nation, but it also left people wondering, how did this happen? How could such a high-profile case go unsolved for so long? What led Mitchell and Barzee to believe they could carry out such an atrocious crime? And how did they manage to keep Elizabeth captive for so many months? As the police began to piece together the full story, they realized that the crime was not just a kidnapping. It was a complex series of lies and manipulations. Mitchell and Barzee had created a false narrative about Elizabeth's captivity, one that would take months to fully understand. Their twisted beliefs and cunning actions had kept Elizabeth trapped, even as the public searched for her. And when she was finally found, the truth behind her abduction and captivity was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The search for Elizabeth Smart began immediately after her disappearance. Salt Lake City became the center of a massive law enforcement effort, with the police leading the charge. Helicopters flew overhead, search dogs combed through nearby parks and wilderness areas, and volunteers from the community joined the search, hoping to find any trace of the missing girl. But despite the intense effort, the trail quickly went cold. At first, investigators thought Elizabeth might have run away or that there was some sort of family connection to the disappearance. But as the hours turned into days and then into weeks, the theory that she had left voluntarily seemed less likely. There were no signs of her leaving the house on her own, no clothes missing, and no messages indicating where she might have gone. This was not the story of a runaway. This was something far worse. The police began to expand their search beyond the local area. They reached out to authorities nationwide, hoping that someone, anywhere, had seen something, anything, that could point them toward Elizabeth's whereabouts. Investigators questioned hundreds, even thousands of individuals. They reached out to friends and family, dug into past relationships, and even examined the Smart family's financial records for any clues that might help explain why someone would take Elizabeth's whereabouts. At the same time, Elizabeth's parents, Ed and Lois Smart, became the faces of the search. They appeared on national news outlets, pleading for the safe return of their daughter. The public was moved by their heartache and their tireless efforts to keep hope alive. They spoke at length about Elizabeth's love for life, her hobbies, and her bright future. They made repeated public appeals, hoping to trigger any kind of response that could lead to her recovery. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the frustration began to settle in. Every lead seemed to fizzle out. The police investigated multiple possibilities, each one leading to a dead end. The Smart family's hope began to fade, and the pressure to find Elizabeth grew unbearable. But unknown to the public, the real breakthrough in the case would not come from the police, but from an unexpected source. Do the favor of subscribing, as it gives me inspiration to give you more juicy contents like this. In the early days of the investigation, the police considered a wide range of potential suspects. It's not uncommon in cases like these for investigators to look within the family, and, for a time, Elizabeth's parents were scrutinized closely. At one point, there was even speculation about the possibility of the Smart family being involved in their daughter's disappearance, and investigation into their finances, relationships, and any possible hidden motives. But this theory was quickly discarded when no evidence was found linking them to the crime. The focus turned outward. The authorities turned their attention to local sex offenders, individuals with a history of violent crimes, and anyone who might have had access to the Smart household. But the deeper they looked, the less promising the leads became. Time and time again, investigators were left with nothing more than false leads and dead ends. Meanwhile, Brian Mitchell and Wanda Barzee, the real perpetrators, were living just miles away from the Smart home, blending in with the community. They were not on anyone's radar. Mitchell, a drifter who had moved to Salt Lake City not long before Elizabeth's abduction, had been living off the grid for years. His criminal history was not widely known, and his strange religious delusions kept him largely isolated from others. Barzee, his wife, had her own history of mental health struggles, which made it easy for her to get swept up in Mitchell's delusions. They lived in a world of their own, disconnected from the reality of the search for Elizabeth Smart. The couple moved frequently, staying in abandoned buildings and using fake identities. They were, for all intents and purposes, invisible to the police. Mitchell believed he was on a divine mission, and Barzee, under his influence, supported his every action. Together they controlled Elizabeth, keeping her hidden from the world and using their twisted beliefs to justify their actions. For months, the police had no idea where they were. Elizabeth was still missing, and Mitchell and Barzee remained at large. Despite their disappearance from the authorities' view, Mitchell and Barzee continued to move around the Salt Lake City area. They would often hide in plain sight, sometimes even walking through public places without drawing attention. Their ability to remain unnoticed was chilling. They would often stay in shelters or isolated locations, moving from one place to another, using their delusions to justify their actions and protect themselves from being caught. As the investigation continued, Mitchell and Barzee's behavior became more erratic. Their belief in their divine mission grew more entrenched. Mitchell became convinced that his abduction of Elizabeth was part of a greater purpose, while Barzee continued to support him, becoming more and more complicit in the crime. Together, they moved further away from the reality of their actions, believing that their mission was justified and that no one could stop them. Then, in March of 2003, nearly 9 months after Elizabeth had been taken, the breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A woman who had been following the case on the news recognized Brian Mitchell and Wanda Barzee from the media coverage of the search. The couple had been living in a nearby town, and the woman had seen them in a public place. She immediately alerted the authorities, and what followed was a series of events that would lead to Mitchell and Barzee's arrest. The tip-off from the woman led police to the location where Mitchell and Barzee were hiding. When they were confronted by law enforcement, they tried to deny their involvement, but the evidence quickly became clear. Elizabeth Smart was found alive, barely 20 miles from her family home. She was reunited with her family, but the relief of finding her was overshadowed by the realization of how close her captors had been all along. Mitchell and Barzee were arrested and taken into custody. The details of Elizabeth's captivity were slowly revealed during the investigation. It became clear that during the time she had been missing, Elizabeth had been subjected to intense manipulation and abuse. Mitchell and Barzee had kept her isolated from the outside world, convincing her that she was part of their divine mission. For 9 months, Elizabeth endured unimaginable hardship, all while her family and the public searched for her in vain. The discovery of Elizabeth Smart's whereabouts and the arrest of Mitchell and Barzee marked the beginning of a long legal process. The case would go to trial and the public would learn the full extent of the abuse Elizabeth had suffered. But even as Mitchell and Barzee were taken off the streets, the case left lingering questions. How did they manage to stay hidden for so long? What motivated them to carry out such a crime? And how did Elizabeth survive? In that brief moment of recognition, the case, which had seemed unsolvable for so long, was broken wide open. Elizabeth was found alive, and the people who had kept her captive for almost 9 months were arrested. The weight of the entire ordeal, the months of uncertainty, the endless searching, the public pleas, came crashing down on everyone involved. As Elizabeth was escorted to safety, the world watched in disbelief. She had been found, but the journey was far from over. The horrors she had experienced were only beginning to come to light. The question on everyone's mind was, how had this been allowed to happen? How had 2 people managed to hold a young girl captive for so long in a city that had been watching for her every day? What followed after her rescue was a deeply emotional and painful process of understanding what Elizabeth had endured. As the investigation continued, the true extent of the abuse and manipulation Elizabeth had suffered became clear. Brian Mitchell, a man with a history of criminal behavior, had carried out his plan under the belief that he was following a divine mission. He had, over time, convinced Elizabeth that she was part of something much larger than herself. He painted a twisted picture of the world, one where he was the prophet and she was a chosen participant. Mitchell's delusions were not new. He had been diagnosed with a range of mental health issues, including schizophrenia. But his actions went beyond his personal demons. His behavior toward Elizabeth was both calculated and cruel. He moved her from place to place, keeping her isolated and under constant control. For the months she was missing, Elizabeth was not allowed to interact with anyone outside of Mitchell and Barzee. She was kept in a bubble of fear, never knowing if or when she would be found. Wanda Barzee, Mitchell's wife, was just as complicit in the crime. Her mental health struggles and her own delusional beliefs made her an ideal partner for Mitchell's warped plans. She did not just stand by as a passive observer, she played an active role in Elizabeth's captivity. Together, Mitchell and Barzee ensured that Elizabeth remained hidden, isolated, and completely at their mercy. When Elizabeth was found, the world celebrated her rescue, but her story was far from over. The impact of her time in captivity would affect her for the rest of her life. Yet, her courage in the face of unimaginable hardship became an inspiration to millions. Elizabeth's strength was evident as she worked to rebuild her life, reclaim her identity, and heal from the trauma she had endured. For Mitchell and Barzee, however, their capture marked the beginning of a long and complex legal process. Both were arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and aggravated kidnapping. Their trials would unfold under public scrutiny as the true scope of their crimes became clear. Mitchell's delusions were central to his defense, with his legal team attempting to argue that his actions were the result of mental illness. But despite these claims, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Brian Mitchell was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Wanda Barzee, who had also been a key participant in Elizabeth's abduction, was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The legal proceedings brought closure to the case, but for Elizabeth and her family, the road to healing was just beginning. Elizabeth's recovery, while remarkable, was not without its challenges. The drama she experienced in the 9 months she was held captive would stay with her for years to come. Yet, through her strength, determination, and the support of her family, Elizabeth began to heal. She went on to become an advocate for missing persons and survivors of trauma, using her voice to bring attention to these issues and to help others who had faced similar struggles. In the aftermath of her rescue, Elizabeth Smart's story became one of survival, resilience, and hope. Her case raised important questions about safety, vulnerability, and the need for vigilance in protecting those most at risk. It also shined a light on the dangers of manipulation and control, showing how easily someone with the right amount of influence could prey on the vulnerable. Elizabeth Smart's case remains one of the most widely covered and emotionally charged stories of abduction and survival. Her story serves as a reminder that even in the most dire of circumstances, there is hope. There is strength, even in the face of unimaginable fear. And, ultimately, there is a chance for healing. But the questions linger. How many more are out there trapped in similar situations? How many more people have been manipulated by those they trusted? And how can we protect others from falling victim to such a nightmare? Elizabeth's rescue was just one piece of the puzzle, but her story continues to inspire and motivate those working to prevent similar crimes from happening in the future. The case of Elizabeth Smart left a lasting mark on the world. It changed how we view missing persons cases, how we approach prevention, and how we support victims in their recovery. But it also left us with an enduring question: how many others, like Elizabeth, are out there waiting to be found? In the aftermath of Elizabeth Smart's miraculous rescue, the legal proceedings against her captors, Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee, began to unfold. Both were taken into custody, charged with a range of serious offenses, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and aggravated kidnapping. The details of their crimes were shocking, and the full extent of their actions would come to light during their separate trials. Brian David Mitchell, who had abducted Elizabeth from her home on June 5, 2002, and held her captive for 9 months, was the primary defendant. His history of mental illness, including a history of schizophrenia and delusions, was used as part of his defense. Mitchell, a man who had spent years on the fringes of society, had long been consumed by religious delusions. He believed that he was a prophet chosen by God to carry out a divine mission. This belief led him to commit unspeakable acts, including abducting Elizabeth and forcing her to live in isolation, away from the world she knew. For months, he kept her under his control, manipulating her with lies and cruelty. Mitchell's defense argued that his actions were a result of his mental illness. His lawyers tried to present him as a man who was incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. However, the prosecution painted a very different picture, one of a man who had knowingly and willfully committed a horrific crime. Mitchell's belief in his divine purpose didn't erase the fact that he had taken a young girl, subjected her to abuse, and held her captive against her will. Ultimately, the jury found Mitchell guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court made it clear that his actions were unforgivable, regardless of his mental state. He was sent to a federal prison where he would remain for the rest of his life. Mitchell's conviction was seen as justice for Elizabeth, but it also served as a grim reminder of how someone's delusions could lead to catastrophic consequences. Wanda Barzee, Mitchell's wife, was also arrested and charged with aiding and abetting Mitchell in the abduction and abuse of Elizabeth. While Barzee had not been the one to carry out the physical act of kidnapping, she played a key role in Elizabeth's captivity. As a woman deeply influenced by Mitchell's delusions, Barzee assisted in keeping Elizabeth under control, even helping to move her from one place to another as they hid out from the authorities. Barzee's involvement in the crime was clear. She was complicit, helping Mitchell in every step of the abduction. Barzee's defense also centered on her mental health issues. She had been diagnosed with several mental disorders, and her lawyers argued that she had been manipulated by Mitchell. However, the prosecution made it clear that while Barzee may have been under Mitchell's influence, she was still responsible for her actions. She had participated in keeping Elizabeth hidden, and she had done nothing to intervene or try to help her. Barzee was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Unlike Mitchell, who would spend his life behind bars, Barzee would eventually be released after serving just over a decade of her sentence. Many believed her sentence was too lenient, especially given the role she had played in Elizabeth's captivity. But the legal system had spoken, and Barzee's conviction was a step toward justice. For Elizabeth Smart, the legal resolution of the case marked the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward healing. After her rescue, she was reunited with her family, but the impact of her captivity would linger long after her return. Elizabeth had spent 9 months in isolation, living under the constant threat of violence and manipulation. The psychological toll of that experience would affect her for years to come. Despite the unimaginable trauma she had endured, Elizabeth's resilience became apparent in the months following her return. She began to speak out about her experience, sharing her story with the world in hopes of helping others who had faced similar struggles. Elizabeth became an advocate for missing persons, working tirelessly to raise awareness about child abductions and to support other survivors of trauma. Her courage in speaking out inspired countless others, and her advocacy efforts began to change how the world viewed missing persons cases. Elizabeth's recovery became a symbol of hope for missing children everywhere. Her story demonstrated that even in the most extreme circumstances, there could be survival, healing, and ultimately, justice. But Elizabeth's case also raised difficult and uncomfortable questions about how someone like Brian Mitchell, with a history of mental illness and violent behavior, could manipulate those around him so effectively. How did he convince Wanda Barzee to assist him in such a monstrous crime? How did he manage to hide Elizabeth in plain sight for so long without raising suspicion? The case also forced the public to confront the reality of how vulnerable children can be to people who seek to exploit them. Mitchell's actions and the way he manipulated Elizabeth and Barzee highlighted the dangers of unchecked delusions and the potential for violence that can stem from untreated mental health issues. It also raised important questions about how the justice system could prevent such crimes from happening in the future, and how society could better protect vulnerable individuals from falling prey to those with harmful intentions. Elizabeth's recovery was remarkable, but it was not without its challenges. The scars from her time in captivity would remain with her for years, and the emotional and psychological toll of what she had endured could not be erased. Still, Elizabeth remained determined to rebuild her life, but brings confusion home, deep sadness for one. She became a mother and continued her advocacy work, using her platform to shine a light on issues of child abduction, trauma recovery, and the importance of supporting survivors. Elizabeth Smart's case was one of the most widely followed and emotionally charged cases in recent history. Her abduction, her survival, and her eventual rescue captured the attention of the world. But beyond the headlines, Elizabeth's journey became a story of hope, healing, and strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. And while her case was resolved in the courts, it left us all with lingering questions about the forces that drive people to commit such horrific acts and how we can prevent similar crimes in the future. Ultimately, Elizabeth Smart's story is a testament to the power of resilience. She overcame the horrors of her captivity, emerged as a survivor, and used her voice to help others. While the legal proceedings against Mitchell and Barzee brought some sense of closure, the true impact of Elizabeth's case will continue to be felt for years to come. It is a reminder that no matter how dark the circumstances may seem, there is always hope, there is always strength, and there is always the possibility of healing. Elizabeth Smart's abduction and subsequent rescue captured the attention of not only the nation but the world. Her case forced us to confront uncomfortable realities about the safety of our children and the hidden dangers that can exist right under our noses. It raised critical questions about how vulnerable children truly are and how criminals, like Brian Mitchell and Wanda Barzee, can move through society undetected, blending in while committing heinous acts. The abduction of Elizabeth Smart highlighted the importance of vigilance in protecting our loved ones. We often think of danger as something distant, something that only happens to others, but this case showed that danger could be right around the corner, and it could happen to anyone. It emphasized the necessity of awareness in our communities, of staying informed and keeping a watchful eye on the world around us. Elizabeth's story also shined a spotlight on the often overlooked issue of mental health. Brian Mitchell's delusions, while clearly disturbing, were not new. His history of mental illness was documented, but it went untreated for much of his life. The tragedy of Elizabeth's abduction was compounded by the realization that a man with these tendencies could operate in society unchecked for so long. His twisted beliefs, coupled with his violent actions, resulted in a crime that affected not only the Smart family, but the entire nation. Though Elizabeth's life was forever changed by her 9 months in captivity, her story became a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit. She survived unimaginable trauma, and instead of letting it define her, she chose to use her experience to help others. Elizabeth's courage, resilience, and determination to move forward became a symbol of hope. Even in the most broken hearts can heal. Elizabeth Smart's recovery, while remarkable, was not without its challenges. The scars of her abduction, both physical and emotional, will remain with her. But through her efforts to raise awareness about missing persons, trauma recovery, and child safety, she has become an advocate for those who cannot speak for themselves. Work, even after so many years, continues to make a difference in the lives of others, reminding us that survival is not just about getting through something, it's about finding a way to thrive despite it. Elizabeth's case may have been resolved, but it leaves us with lingering questions that are harder to answer. How many other children are out there, still trapped in similar situations, hidden from the world? How many abductions have gone unnoticed, and how many criminals are still hiding in plain sight? We can never know for sure, but the fact remains, the safety of our children is never guaranteed. We must ask ourselves, are we doing enough to protect the most vulnerable among us? The case of Elizabeth Smart serves as both a wake-up call and a challenge. It reminds us that vigilance is key, that we cannot afford to overlook the signs of danger, even in the places we feel safest. How can we ensure that children everywhere are as safe as possible? Are there more actions we could take to prevent tragedies like this from happening in the first place? What are your thoughts on the Elizabeth Smart case? What steps do you think we can take as a society to better protect children and prevent such crimes from occurring? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on how we can make our communities safer for everyone. If you found this story both heartbreaking and inspiring, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. This is just one of many true crime stories we'll be covering, so don't miss out on future episodes. Be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into one of the most harrowing cases in recent history. We hope Elizabeth's story has moved you as much as it has us. Stay tuned for more and keep the conversation going in the comments. Together, we can stay informed, aware, and vigilant.